Welcome back to BT Vancouver on a Thursday morning, approaching 7:46. We're going to talk about police brutality, police reform, and the media's role in covering all of these aspects of the protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd. We're going to bring back our good friend from SFU, Adel Askandar. Welcome back to BT.
Thanks very much for having me, Thor.
First of all, let's talk about the news of the day. Victoria Police have adopted recommendations and measures to address discrimination and racism. Kennedy Stewart, the mayor of Vancouver, will be mentioning this a little bit later on when it comes to police reform in Vancouver. Is this kind of thing long overdue, not only locally, but in North America?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the case of Vancouver and Victoria, this is, the tip of the iceberg. We'd like to see this nationwide. But having said that, this is a really great start to opening up the conversation and thinking in a proactive way about ways to reform policing in communities and in larger cities, as well as more sort of far-flung areas. It's also happening in Saskatchewan. It's happening in Alberta. The conversation is open. Newspapers in Montreal are covering discussions around defunding and what defunding looks like. So I think this is, getting ahead of the curve, or at least responding to the calls, the public calls. We've seen thousands of people protest in Vancouver, at least a few hundreds in Victoria and elsewhere. So there's definitely a public call for reform. So being proactive in that regard is a promising start, but it's also the beginning of the conversation.
And let's talk about this defunding issue, because we're hearing that a lot in the headlines these days when it comes to law enforcement. Many arguing that money used for policing should be put towards other areas in the community. It seems like a very broad term. Do you see an advantage in defunding the police or having their budgets allocated differently?
I mean, I think a budget revision is certainly overdue for policing, not just across Canada, but almost certainly in the United States. It's important for audiences and listeners to realize that defunding doesn't mean the dissolution of policing, the end of law and order, and sort of the ushering in of anarchy. Instead, it has more to do with reconstituting it in a way that the system operates better, steadily reducing the budgets for policing and instead reinvesting funds towards community and what helps community. And sometimes that includes housing, safe supply, peer support, peer outreach, access to public space, also creating community connections with community that would reduce the potential for criminal action. So there's a lot of transformative justice, and there are examples of this happening elsewhere in the world, including a few smaller cities in the U.S. where it's been productive. So it's the revision and the discussion about defunding should not be a sort of a knee-jerk, oh my goodness, what does it mean? What does it entail? It's actually a very productive discussion and may lead somewhere positive.
But when we look at the cost of transparency, it's almost ironic because there's calls for body cameras for police officers, but then a lot of law enforcement agencies saying that the problem with the body cameras are that they're just too costly, but that would be a way to possibly make police more accountable. So that seems like a tricky situation.
It is, and those tricky situations are so frequent now. I mean, at the end of the day, most police officers and those who are engaged in direct contact with the public are less concerned about the actual budgets of the institutions and more concerned about what they can and cannot do and the accountability that they have to face. So as you're seeing in the cameras in front of you, the screen, these actions are becoming so frequent that without body cameras, without documentation, there will simply be no accountability. You can imagine how many George Floyds there might have been out there that we know nothing about, where there was no documentation of any of these violations, which allows police to continue to act with incredible impunity. And that, of course, means that the media, who serve as the cameras and the eyes and ears to the world and the public at large, are also facing the same types of criticism from the police.
I'm glad you mentioned the media, because there are growing calls from various police unions in the States saying how the media are essentially vilifying law enforcement, and that gets to the issue of responsibility of covering these kind of events. Do you see this kind of vilification of law enforcement happening, and are media being targeted by law enforcement as well?
I mean, it's an extremely fine line between accusing the media of vilifying and doing exactly what the media is supposed to do, which is to serve as, serve in the public interest. So when we have the kinds of violation that we've witnessed in the last few weeks, it's only appropriate for the media to do what they're doing. And just to keep our audiences aware, in the case of the United States, U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is an organization of a coalition of press freedom groups in the U.S., they've counted at least 300 incidents of police brutality against journalists in the last couple of weeks. That includes 49 arrests, 192 assaults, 160 of those by police officers uniformed. 42 equipment and newsroom damage, assault categories break down to 69 physical attacks, 43 by cops. I mean, the numbers are plentiful. One photographer lost an eye to rubber bullets. I mean, some of these are documented, but some of them are not. But people are more inclined to file reports and bring those accusations forward, and that is an indication that there is a problem. So the police brutality in almost all instances precedes the media coverage. In fact, media coverage has been quite minimal on police brutality for many years, and that's part of the reason why protesters are so aggravated. So I think this is lopsided, and it only makes sense for police officers and police unions to be advocating for their own in what is otherwise a deeply unequal arrangement in favor of them.
All right, Adel, we have to leave it there, but we really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, have a great day. That's Adel Askandar from SFU, and we'll be back with